This is In Hindsight, half a century of research discoveries in Canadian history, presented by Dr. Donald B. Smith and produced by the Ontario Historical Society.
It's a great pleasure today to talk about episode 5, which is about Peter and Eliza, and I'll explain their story shortly. This is exciting for me because it's the beginning of really 4 episodes. We're going to be dealing first with Peter and Eliza, and then 3 more stories relating to the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I'll explain who they are in this first of 4 episodes. And I'd like to just explain at the outset, I've been working on this in this area it's unbelievable. I don't think there's many academics that have done this. I have been working on this subject for over 50 years, and I'm still passionate about it. It's just wonderful material. And in fact, just going through my notes in preparation for the series, I found that I wrote my PhD thesis proposal 51 years ago. I found it. And it's about the topic of the Mississauga. It's about specifically Peter Jones, or Kahkewaquonaby, or Sacred Feathers in his Ojibwe language. So it's been I'm very long in the tooth on this topic. And as I say, it's just energizing. Well, what we're going to be doing in the first of these 4 episodes is looking at a relationship between a Mississauga First Nations person and an English woman. It's a love story, and it begins in 1831. To begin at the beginning, I'd like to introduce you to Peter Jones, who's First Nations person, Mississauga, Anishinaabe, and he had just been to England, and I'll give more background shortly. He'd just been to England and actually had fallen in love with an English woman, and they married. She accepted his marriage proposal, and actually made it on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1832. But he did give her a word of caution. And he went back to Canada, and her name, Eliza Field, she stayed in England for just to prepare herself and all. And she had to get her family's permission. That was difficult. Well, I'll explain why shortly. But there was also other problems, and Peter was quite forward on it, quite open. There was a problem. And he wrote her just before she sailed to New York, where they were married, and then they went up to Upper Canada, as Ontario was then called, to the Native community. But just before she sailed, he warned her. The fact is, my beloved Eliza, settlers think it is not right for the whites to marry with Indians. Made it quite clear. There was opposition. And he warned her of this. Didn't mean a thing to her. Didn't deter her. And she sailed for New York. It's just wonderful. Very courageous woman, very independent-minded. And let's now go into a little bit further, because it's quite a story. And I came across this one early in my research career, and I certainly enjoyed researching it and going right to the bottom of it. Well, how can we tell all this? Why? What sources do I have? Let's begin. Let's come clean about the sources. What makes this topic so incredibly rich is we have the diaries of both parties. We have the diaries of Peter Jones, or Sacred Feathers, or Kahkewaquonaby. That's for the purposes of the episode. Just call him Peter Jones, his English name. And anyways, we have his diaries, quite a few of them. We have even more of hers, Eliza Fields. So it is quite something in Canadian history to have both diaries in a relationship. It's just extraordinary, especially for this time period, the 1830s. So thanks to those diaries, and that is part of the discovery aspect of this. Peter Jones's diary was published after his death. His wife, Eliza Field Jones, she edited it and brought it forward. And so we had that already, but it's her diaries that are the story. And I'm not claiming some great kudos for doing it, but they'd already were known at Victoria University Library, Victoria University in the University of Toronto. Their library had these diaries, but they'd been forgotten. And, well, yours truly was right in there. And I don't want to get too cocky about this, but I think I was certainly, I would suspect, the first to go through them diligently in the early 1970s. So I had Peter Jones' diary that was published. I had her diaries, and we're off. So what is going on here? How did these two people meet? How did they come to be, a North American Indian and an Englishwoman? Well, it dates back to, well, I'll tell you, it's hard to know how much to say about Peter at this stage. I'll introduce him briefly, though, and we'll come back to him. We got 3 more episodes. He comes in and out. Well, Peter Jones, he was born right where Dundurn Castle is today in Hamilton, Ontario. It's beautiful castle, big home, huge home on Burlington Heights. And he was born in that site. There was nothing there. It was just forested land. And it was 1802 he was born and raised among his mother's people. So he grew up as a Anishinaabe, as a Ojibwe. He grew up as a Mississauga. The Mississauga is a name that settlers use for the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe on the North Shore of Lake Ontario. But he grew up with his mother's people, with the First Nations traditions and all, up to the age of 14. But then, just after the War of 1812, his dad, who was non-Indigenous, pulled him out of the community and took him to his farm west of what's now Hamilton. And there, Peter Jones learned how to farm. And shortly after that, he was converted to Christianity, converted to Methodism, which is today United Church of Canada, is the modern descendant of the Methodist Church of this time period. They were evangelical Protestants, evangelical Christians, and Peter, for reasons which will be explained actually in more depth in one of the 3 later episodes, became a very fervent Methodist, and very much so that he did so because, well, it was his decision. He had he never had a vision quest, which is very central in First Nation spirituality in the Great Lakes area. He didn't have a spiritual experience fully. And, well, in short, Methodism fills a gap. For him, I think Jesus becomes something like a spiritual intervener for him. And it's his translation into his own culture of spirituality was very meaningful to him. And this gets quite deep. I don't want to do that now. Just to simply explain that he became a Methodist, he did translation. He was essential. Through him, the non-Indigenous Methodists were able to reach all kinds of First Nations First Nations people in Southern Ontario, and he led them. Peter Jones was the leader, and he led them to start an agricultural settlement just west of Toronto, 20 kilometers west of Toronto, at the mouth of the Credit River, which is now Port Credit, or part of Mississauga, the regional municipality of Mississauga, city of Mississauga, excuse me. So he started, it was very much in this village situation. He helped with non-Indigenous helpers, including Edgerton Ryerson, who was the first founder of the public school system in Ontario later on. Edgerton Ryerson was the first missionary to work with the Credit First Nations people, with Peter Jones, and they became extremely close. This is now in the mid-1820s. The agricultural settlement was a success. The Mississauga of the Credit River began to farm, and they started other businesses. Like, for example, a sawmill. They had actually even had a schooner at one point, and they were successful adjusting to farming. It was a big success story. So the Methodists, the non-Indigenous Methodists, were very impressed by him. He took training and became an ordained Methodist minister himself. And he was like the poster boy for the non-Indigenous Methodists of the potentials of reaching out to the First Nations. So he becomes an ordained minister. And in 1831, he's sent to raise money for the mission schools in Britain. Britain at this point is the richest, it's the center of the British Empire, which is the richest, the most powerful empire at the time, the early 19th century. So he's going to go there and raise cash. And he does. He does a missionary tour of Britain in 1831-32, and it is very successful. So that is the entry point now for Eliza. The experience in Britain was good, apart from the fact that the damp weather had dire consequences on Peter. He became quite ill, and in Bristol he was kept. Well, he had to stay in one of the Methodist family's homes for 7 weeks to recover. It was at that time that a young woman, I was not super young, but a woman in her mid-20s, visited, and that's how the link becomes. She was very impressed by him. Who's this woman? Well, her name was Eliza Field, and she was from London. Well, she's actually from South London. The other, just in the district called Lambeth, which is on the south bank of the Thames. And she was raised there. Her family had been in the soap and candle business for 300 years. They were very wealthy. They had 2 homes. One was in Lambeth. Let's just say South London. That's an abbreviation, and it will work for us. The home in Lambeth, near Waterloo Station, if you know London. Waterloo Station today, not then. But in any case, they had another home. It was south at a place called Norwood, and Holly Cottage is what they called it. It was about 10 kilometers south of London, and that was their refuge. Her father, Charles Field, had the soap and candle business going back 300 years. Anyways, their business was there, and that was an industrial area. They had this escape of going to Norwood, to Holly Cottage. So there's 2 residences. Well, Eliza was very impressed by Peter. He was he was articulate. He did English. He learned English. He'd been with his father for 7 years, and he'd gone to school for a year or 2, and he'd learned English. He was and such a sincere, genuine person. She was very impressed by him. And she said, she met him in Bristol when he was recovering, and said, well, when you're back in London, come and see us. And he did. And he visited her, visited them in both residences, in their comfortable home in Lambeth and also in Norwood. So he made a big impression. The family were evangelical Anglicans. They shared that enthusiasm about Christianity. That was a link. It was a bit of a jump, though. Methodism was not, the Anglican faith was not the same as the Methodists had some differences. They were far more enthusiastic than the Anglicans, and the Anglicans had some concerns about them, actually. Nevertheless, they were sort of soul brothers. And Eliza had this is, in fact, he was a Methodist. That was okay with her. Not so much with her father, but he came around. So they are just having a very happy friendship. But things start to move. Peter's in London a lot because he's raising money. One point of what helps him a lot with Eliza is he meets her minister, Reverend Rowland Hill, and Reverend Hill is very impressed by him because he talks directly. He doesn't have Reverend Rowland Hill was really a direct speaker and didn't like complicating the gospel too much. He was an Anglican. He was an evangelical Anglican. Anyways, he got along with Peter extremely well, and that helped the cause. So they are getting quite chummy, and it's quite extraordinary because Peter had best, I guess if you stretched it, 2 years of education, and Eliza she had attended a fashionable boarding school for 8 years. She'd studied landscape painting under a French artist, living in London. She'd gone on riding trips in the country near the Welsh border. She'd spent vacations at Brighton on the English Channel. Brighton was where George IV had built his fantasy out of the Arabian Nights, the Royal Pavilion. This woman was traveled, well educated, but not completely happy. At this stage in her life, she felt she wanted to do something. She wanted to make something of her life. And then Peter just was an instant success. She liked him so much. As she wrote in her diary on July the 2nd, 1832, I feel impatient to be more useful, to be more entirely employed for the benefit of others. And she saw this possibility of helping the First Nations, the Methodist First Nations in Upper Canada, as Ontario was then called. This was attractive. But there's so many differences between the two. If Eliza's background was abundance, Peter's was want. Two totally different backgrounds. However, the connection was made, and it was a strong one, became stronger. Peter, his duties were quite onerous. He gave, I believe, 100 talks, and he did very well. He raised £1,000, which was a wonderful asset for the schools, and it really helped a great deal. He did 150 addresses and sermons in that 1 year in England. Well, it's time to close it up. They're going to, that's when Peter makes his proposal. He's got to go back to Canada, and they are doing their relationship is really moving along. I just did take this example. My goodness, January the 4th, 1833. Eliza's diary. She says there. She wrote that on her entry that day was Indian words. Ginashi, kiss me. Kimiwanuin, I love you. Oh my gosh, everything's moving along. Well, Peter a month later proposed. Well, everything was okay with Eliza, of course. She was very, very eager to accept, but her dad wasn't. She found, well, his father had, this impoverished clergyman, how can he possibly look after his daughter in the style she's accustomed? And then secondly, he was an Anglican and he was a Methodist, so there was a religious issue. And thirdly, there also in the family, one of the relatives was opposed to this interracial marriage. So it was uphill there. So what happened? What breaks the logjam? And that is truly it, because Dad said no, you can't go. And it's Victorian. It's early, but it's not yet Victorian days, but it's early 19th century Britain. There's so many, for her upper middle class milieu, there's lots of constraints here. How are we going to get around this? Well, lifeline. Egerton Ryerson. Wow. Egerton Ryerson was in England. He had come over. He'd become quite an important figure in the Methodist Church in Upper Canada, as Ontario was then called. And the two wings of the church, there was an English wing and a Canadian wing, and they'd been separated. And there was an initiative to bring them together. And Egerton Ryerson he went to Britain to bring this about, to help unite the British and the Canadian sections of the Methodist Church in Canada. So that's pretty complex, and we don't need to worry about that. The fact for us, all we need to worry about is he was in Britain at the time, and he intervenes, as does Reverend Alder. He was the missionary superintendent for the English side, and Egerton's for the Canadians. And anyways, Reverend Alder intervenes as well. And this is interesting because Alder his name is still in our lexicon. It's still on the maps, in that the First Nations community at Rice Lake, on the south side of Rice Lake, is called Alderville. Because it was named after him. It was a Methodist First Nations community, and they chose that name almost 200 years ago, and it's still there, Alderville. And our good friend Dave Mowat is from Alderville, so that definitely has to be mentioned. So, well, anyways, then Reverend Alder and Edgerton Ryerson intervene, and it helps a lot. Edgerton was, it's sort of bit Hollywood, but it's a phrase that I think works. He and Peter were blood brothers. I'm not in any official way, but they were so close. They were about the same age. They were outdoors people. They were very concerned about Christianity, and very concerned about getting the First Nations were in terrible shape because they hadn't, all these settlers had come, they didn't have secure title to their land. They had no, until they started farming, there was no means of support. But Edgerton, he was 100% behind them on that, and he also fought for their land rights. Now, the only negative is, and this is the way it was, there was your way, my way, or the highway. That's the way it was. The stipulation is you have to become Christian. You have to. This is the, in hindsight, of course, this is the tragedy of it all, that the non-Indigenous people did not recognize Native spirituality, but that's it's just, that is the reality, and so that can always be brought forward. But nevertheless, there is in my opinion, a very strong positive. They wanted the First Nations to economically adjust and to have be able to protect themselves. And they had to know English for that. That's why schools are so important. But true, you have to accept this. The deal was you had to become Methodist. Well, I'd argue that, yes, they did become Methodists, but they remained First Nations people. They were Indigenous Christians. Well, it does work. It's quite uphill, but Charles Field, he gives his approval, and Eliza will go back. She'll go across the North Atlantic. She's not going back. She's leaving her home. This is think of this, and it's a milestone, really. She's giving up all her privileges in Britain and going across, and she's going to be as the wife of a First Nations missionary. She's going to live in a log cabin. And her dad is he's trying to do his best. So he sends her, when she leaves, he gives her to take with her some fine china and some Persian rugs. Can you imagine all that for a log cabin? But that was just his way of expressing his support, begrudgingly, but he was on side at the end. So Eliza sails, and she comes to New York. They're married September the 8th, 1833. And, odds were against them. The New York papers heard about this interracial marriage, and there was all kinds of scuttlebutt in the New York press. Can imagine, you're just married, and all these stories, just really derogatory stories, which were picked up in Upper Canada. So they really have, right from the beginning, Peter and Eliza, interracial marriage. This is a challenge. Didn't matter. They were in love. They got through it. Eliza persevered and loyally supported her husband, and Peter loyally supported her. In fact, she would make a very, very important contribution in the community. She helped with teaching domestic, non-Indigenous home affairs, cooking, and sort of an education with two of the girls. She was very good with helping them with English, and she took a role and supported her husband. She wrote, for example, she transcribed the council minutes. She wrote petitions. It's not her words. The words are written by her, but the words are Peter's and the Council of the Credits words. So it really was impressive. And we can't tell too much more now because we got 3 more episodes. Got to hold back. With great difficulty, I will. Just to end, though, eventually there were 4 children, and one became a medical doctor. And it was a very, very successful marriage. So let's leave the last word. Oh, well, Edgerton Ryerson, for example, he will be the second last word, and then we'll have Eliza at the end. Edgerton Ryerson's comment after Peter's death, he died in 1856, and Edgerton Ryerson said, "I questioned whether a happier marriage than theirs, on both sides, was ever experienced." Truly, in life, they were of one heart. I imagine when Edgerton said that, his voice would have quivered too. These people were so close to him. Well, Eliza, what was her? What did she think of all this? Well, she lived up to 1890. I mean, she was not in any way leaving so soon. She married again about 5 or so years later, and it was just a mess. She had it was a terrible marriage, and so it's in that spirit that she wrote this. Well, looking back, she said, "Then and now," Eliza wrote, these cruel things that were said and written about them being an interracial couple and all this was fated for disaster and all that was totally incorrect. It was a wonderful marriage. Well, she wrote, "I look with pity on those who from ignorance and prejudice viewed the alliance with contempt, deeming them not worthy to tread in the shadow of my honored husband." Well, you haven't heard the last of me on Peter and Eliza. Episodes 6, 7, and 8 are related to the Mississaugas of the Credit, and they will return. Thank you.